So we're talking about a new section here, moving into renew your community. We talk about your focus. We talk about renew your leadership. Of course, we're moving around through this. Now we're talking about renewing your community, the church itself. Now, in the last session, I gave an example about worship, but really it was an example of leadership, how to lead people through there. But we want to talk some about the worship. This session marks the beginning of the section on renewed community. We need to rethink and revive our church community to use that gathering time on the weekend for the glory of God and for a greater advance of His kingdom. And this is kind of a window, right? The church is like a window to the kingdom of God. People look into the churches to say, oh, that's what the kingdom of God looks like. Now, when we look at research, we look back several research projects, we've seen people consistently describe their worship as comeback churches or revitalized churches were celebrative, things of that sort, were informal, contemporary, more so than traditional. Now, again, I want to say that right at the front, that churches that were revitalized were contemporary more than traditional. Not everyone likes that, but that's actually the math. Doesn't mean that there weren't churches that were revitalized that were traditional. There were, but as a whole, it was more common, the contemporary than the traditional. Now, we're going to take a look at several things here. We actually will put a graphic on the screen. You can take a look. This is sort of the graphic from comeback churches. It talks about celebrative, orderly, informal, contemporary, expressive. These were in comeback churches, what we saw. Now, let's talk about worship, and let's talk about worship matters, because it does. Worship does matter in revitalization. Some naive people have sort of thrown out the idea that you don't need to think about this worship in the midst of this, and it does. It does matter a lot. Why? Because worship is going to ultimately be what we do for eternity. It's ultimately, we'll be gathered around the throne with men and women from every tongue, tribe, and nation. Worship is something that churches do together, and really it becomes a point of how people respond to the way they worship. And I will tell you, probably more people trying to lead through revitalization have been fired because of changes to a worship service than for anything else. Now, why? Well, in some cases, it's so central because the gospel itself leads us away from the worship itself towards the worship of God. Jesus, after all, talks about the difference between false worship and true worship. Something special happens when a believer worships in spirit and in truth. We know that. So what we see, fine, when we did our transformational church research, right? We did this study about the impact of worship. The study found 75% of churches that were seeing regular, consistent transformation in the lives of their people. So evidence of God changing lives as a direct result of their worship services or worship experiences. That's an important number. Worship is very central and a very important part of transformation and change in the life of the church. Now, what I would encourage you is not to rush in and say, I want to revitalize our church, so we got to go contemporary and we're going to do this or that. That's not the answer, but to look at how believers are called to engage in worship, not argue about it, it's a mark of maturity, and to walk the path where our worship service is not driven by the customer preferences of our people, but by ultimately inviting people in to worshiping the triune God who is holy, perfect, and timeless in a cultural moment where we find ourselves. So to do that, you have to lead your people to understand the importance of worship for transformation and to give up preferences for the sake of mission in worship. Let me say that again. You have to lead your people to understand the importance of worship for transformation and to give up preferences for the sake of the mission. Now, I'm going to tell you this. I tend to not like the worship music at most churches that I serve. Now, that may seem strange to you. I've been interim pastor, I'm teaching pastor. I prefer worship from the 80s. Now, why is that? Because they won't let me. I play guitar, but badly. Used to lead worship, but poorly. They don't let me pick worship songs at church because most people will revert back to the time when, as a new believer, their worship habits were kind of created and established, and so it is for me. So I don't find myself, when worshiping, automatically thinking back of traditional hymns, because I was a child of the contemporary church movement. But if you give me majesty, if you say, I love you, Lord, and I lift my voice, then for me, that locks into it. So when I sing alone, and I do indeed sing alone when I'm worshiping, those are the songs that I tend to sing, not oceans, neither do I sing Holy, Holy, Holy. So those tend to be the songs I tend to sing. So the same is true. So if I was driven by my customer preferences, my church would look probably like a Calvary Chapel in 1989. But the reality is I don't live in 1989 in Southern California, so we've got challenges. So let's look at some obstacles to renewed worship and think about them some. First, obstacle number one, failure to see worship as integral to mission. So we need to realize we're not going to please everyone all the time, and we don't choose, and you can teach this and preach this, we don't choose our worship approach on the basis of our preferences, but instead based upon our mission. This is the very thing that we would require international missionaries to do. We would say, if you're going to go to the Pokot in Africa, you need to ask questions about their cultural forms, about times and dress and music, and say, so they can worship God in spirit and in truth. Now, why? I think people should ask still today. If you're revitalizing a church, you shouldn't pick what you like. They shouldn't pick what they like. We shouldn't negotiate what we would all tolerate, but ask, what form of music would best suit our context here today so that people could worship God in spirit and truth? So I think multiple services can be healthy and unhealthy. But if it's a missiological decision, rather than pandering to Christian consumer mentality, I think we can say, you know what, a couple of different worship styles might indeed engage different communities here for the cause of Christ so that we might worship in spirit and in truth. But don't pander. Just say up front, call it out, talk about it in a sermon. And say, we don't want to be driven by customer preferences here. Not my preferences either. So now again, if you keep saying we don't want to be driven by customer preferences, and then you say, but I really like so-and-so, you're picking your customer preferences. But instead, if you'd say, let's walk this journey, let's missiologically discern how we might know this community better. Let me tell you a story. So I was leading one church through revitalization, and we decided we needed to go find out the neighborhood. You might do this along the way. So we actually went out, I trained them. I gave them little clipboards, right? And little clipboards. We would go door to door in our community, and we would invite people. I'm sorry, that's wrong. We would survey people, not invite people to our church. So I trained them. We got some, very innocuous questions like, why do you think most people don't go to church nowadays? When you ask somebody that question, what they'll answer is why they don't go to church. Or another one of the questions was, what do you think most people think about our church, and name the church? And so we sent them out. We sent them out in groups of two. So I was on one side of the street, and then a couple of ladies, and with a gentleman from the church. A couple of ladies were on the other side of the church, the other side of the street, narrow streets. So by the time we walked up our sidewalk to knock on our door, I heard banging on the door across the street. And one of the ladies had picked up it was an older church, had picked up her rubber-tipped cane and was knocking on the door with it. And a young Latino male must have been seated at the couch by the door, opens the door, and I can hear her say, the preacher wants us to ask you, why won't you go to our church? And I was like, well, that's not really what we were going for. So we brought them back for mandatory retraining. But when we went out door to door, and we asked them those simple questions, and we'll put an example in the bonus thing of the survey. It's just simple, just asking questions like this. Why do you think most people don't go to church nowadays? We're asking the question of, what do you know about such and such church, our church? And then how do you think churches can be more helpful to the community? Simple questions. We learn a lot, and conversations can start. Sometimes even witnessing conversations can start. So 3 simple questions. You can find it in the extra resources we provide for you. So what happened was they came back aware of the community in a way that they were not aware before. So again, why? This becomes up later when we'd walk through the 4-week worship experiment, because now they saw worship as integral to mission. Now that really matters. It's really key. So that's obstacle 1, is failure to see worship as integral to mission. Obstacle 2 is comfort and resistance to change. We always done it that way. You may have heard that before. We've always done it that way, Pastor. The truth is, most people struggle with any kind of change in church life. What's familiar, what's comfortable is what we're used to. And they have resistance. People have resistance to change. This will be done more easily, as you begin to lead people spiritually. They see it as part of the mission. Do you see? So much of church revitalization is taking people on a journey, not driving them on a path. Look what the neighborhood looks like. Remember what I talked about recently in another session. Look what churches that are reaching people in our neighborhood actually look like. What could we do? Let's think about that together. Not driving them on a path, but walking with them on a journey. Because everybody wants comfort over change. I do too. I mean, that's just human nature. We don't want change. So now that matters deeply. So obstacle number 3 to renewed worship is fighting every battle and dying on every hill. Listen, if there's something essential to some people that this piece of furniture not be moved, don't move that piece of furniture. Because of fighting battles, no matter how worthy, you gain little strategic ground. So now again, as serving at Moody Church, I haven't made a lot of changes. One of the changes I did make is, I know as they've been looking for a new pastor, when that new pastor will come, the new pastor can go several different directions. What I wanted to do is to create some space that the new pastor could go on different directions. So, for example, a lot of times I don't use the pulpit, which is, people will actually comment on Facebook sometimes that they're where'd the pulpit go. But I use a little screen. I use a little a TV screen with my computer notes projected. And I tell people, this helps the people. We have an overflow room, helps people in the overflow room, people watching online. People watch online all over the world. Now again, that's hard for some people, but there are also some things that I don't do. There are some things that, and part, for that matter, the new pastor can go back any direction the new pastor wants to go. Could change this direction or that direction. But what I would say is be strategic. So I was literally trying to be strategic as an interim, saying, you know what, I bet a new pastor might have some different ideas, and if the new pastor doesn't, they can go back to whatever work they want to do. I still use the pulpit at times as well. But being strategic, so I'm strategically deciding not to use the pulpit, so the new pastor has a little more space. But we got to think through what's a battle worth fighting, what's a battle not worth fighting as well. And so that's ultimately the key. Obstacle number 4 is the contemporary obsession. Actually, what we found is that church renewal does occur with different styles of worship. Now, again, it's more contemporary than traditional. I'd be lying to you if I said otherwise. They tend to trend that direction. But one of the things, the reality is you can be a vibrant, growing church if, for example, I mentioned Moody Church. Moody Church is traditional. Moody Church has members of the Chicago Symphony who come every week. Moody Church has people who go to, it's not reaching, I was talking to Tim Keller once about this. The Redeemer Presbyterian that Tim Keller used to pastor is pretty traditional. My kids went there, and they're children of the contemporary church. And they, the Sunday we went, my oldest daughter said, "This is so boring." Now, mind you, it depends about to whom it's boring. And when you're like Moody Church or like Redeemer, when you're engaging a certain segment of a city, that's not automatically going to be a contemporary church worship expression. So, but what I would say is think through how best to worship the Lord in spirit and truth in this cultural context and more. So I'm not so concerned that worship be contemporary, though most of the time in most revitalized churches it is more so. I'm not concerned, though, that church be contemporary. I'm concerned that it be contextual. Is it contextually appropriate to its setting? So again, we're not driven by being contemporary, we're driven by being contextual. Obstacle number 5 is a program mentality. See, again, programs have an impact on the lives of people, and people, I'm not anti-programs. Programs can be tools. But the gospel is ultimately a reminder that we move from worship of self towards the worship of God. And so one of the things that happens is authentic worship can sometimes be sort of driven by a certain way that we feel that it might necessary to be done, maybe because we've always done it that way before. So, for example, the program mentality is we sing these 2 hymns, we have this offering, we sing these 2 hymns, we have a sermon, whatever it may be. And I think a way to help with that is to understand that true transformative worship doesn't always have to follow the playbook that somebody gave us. Now, some of us may be in churches that follow the liturgical calendar or whatever else. But I found, let me give you an example. Churches in my tradition tend to not highly focus on the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. So one of the things I like to do is to actually, particularly when I'm in a church in revitalization, I want revitalization to be a spiritual task, not just an organizational one, is I'll often focus in on the Lord's Supper and worship. And so I might say, maybe we'll do this monthly in some churches, some of you do weekly, I get that. But to take some time to say, let's walk through this more than just, here's some perfunctory words we say, a quick program we follow, take the bread, take the cup, but to actually say, let's take a few moments and dwell on what is this body. Let's take a few moments to talk about what the blood means and how Jesus' blood was shed for us. And to actually walk people through a process of repenting of sin, of preparing their hearts, of receiving the elements and more. Why? Because it breaks us out of that obstacle 5 of that program mentality. And it helps us to worship in spirit and in truth. Now, again, we can do a lot of different ways to do that. I want you to hear that I recognize many different traditions watch this. And I love the beauty of a liturgical worship service with a centrality on the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist. I think that can be wonderfully beautiful. What I want to exhort you to is worship that is appropriately contextual, God-centered, not driven by some sort of program or tradition that has lost its meaning as well. Yaroslav Pelikan is very famous for saying this phrase, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. I don't want us to be driven by traditionalism, but I recognize we can revel in the beauty of tradition, which is the living faith of the dead, rather than being trapped in traditionalism, which is that program mentality, which is the dead faith of the living. Now, again, I think we can talk some about some steps to ask how to do that. I wrote an article on this in Outreach Magazine a while ago, along with David Putman, and I asked 4 questions. We asked 4 questions in there. Is your worship rooted in your context, or is it anchored in an era? Now, don't miss that, right? Is your worship rooted in your context? Now, beginning with the idea that biblical worship is going to flow from an understanding of who Jesus is, giving praise, but then at some point, your style is going to be rooted in an era or a context. Why? Because the Bible gives us no style hints. All right, we think about the Psalms, right? We've got Selah. So when you think about Selah, what does that mean? Can I tell you? Nobody knows. Some people think it means pause, but nobody knows for sure what it actually means. So there's literally musical notations in the Bible that we don't know how to do today. And I think that might be a reminder that God didn't intend us to have any particular musical style. I believe God can and does use any form of music for his glory and honor. There's no such thing as Christian music. There's only Christian lyrics. God can use any form of music for his glory and honor except country western. And the reason he doesn't use country western, he could, but he loves you. And so he doesn't use that for that purpose. I'm kidding. Don't send me notes. So the question we asked is your worship rooted in your context or anchored to an era? Number 2, are you more concerned about preserving your culture than engaging your community? Number 3, are you using the best tools available to you and relevant to your context to make worship valuable and excellent? And number 4, is your worship an inclusive experience that fosters congregational participation? And when you see those things come together, really before anything truly of God can be born as worship, I think your own preferences have to die. Your desire to leave a contemporary, traditional, whatever, casual, formal, whatever church has to be laid at the altar and sacrificed in order to receive Christ's call, his mission, and to draw people to worship God in spirit and truth. So my question for you is, personally, are you willing to die to your preferences to reach so that people in your community can engage in spirit and truth? Is your church willing to move out of its Christian subculture? Because we can get trapped in a Christian subculture. Now, it's very easy to point back, well, traditional churches are trapped in the 1800s. Can I tell you, I work with a lot of churches that are trapped in 1985, where they've kind of birthed in that era. The worship team kind of looks like the Beach Boys, but the Beach Boys now, not the Beach Boys then. You're sort of trapped in that era. Every song sounds like a big prom song to Jesus, and they're sort of trapped in that sound. And what I would say is, they're as much driven by consumerism and as much trapped in an era as a church that might sing in ways that we find unhelpful and out of time as well. So here's the deal. Is it possible that you and your church are missing out on some blessings of the gospel because you've been unwilling to die to your preferences as well? So let me give you some quick steps here to make some worship changes. Number 1, step 1, we'll jot these down quickly. Get some of the leaders in your church to visit some of the churches in your area that are actually engaging the kind of community you want to engage. I've already mentioned how we did that. So get some of your leaders to visit some of those churches. Step 2, consider leading that worship experiment. We maybe take, here's 4 or 5 or 7 different approaches to worship. Let's look at it, just see what it's like. Step 3, meet with people in your community. Get their take on how churches are inviting people in and engaging their community. Some people immediately say, well, worship is not to reach people. Okay, get it, I get it. But at the same time, what we do know is that on 2 occasions, Paul writes, what happens when unbelievers show up in your worship experience? Here's the deal. Unbelievers are going to show up in your worship experience. What are they going to take away? Are they going to say, there are people like me here. Man, they seem deeply in love with Jesus and singing to him through their songs, but I actually can relate a little bit to who they are culturally. We must not forbid North American churches to do the very thing we require international missionaries to do. Let me say it again so you don't miss it. We must not forbid North American churches to do the very thing we require international missionaries to do. So you need to, like a missionary, meet with some people, get their take on approaches to church that are connecting well with people. Step 4, host a church-wide meeting. Let people to process and to be heard and to hear and to walk through this together. And step number 5, implement some changes. Maybe changes as focus, explain why, help people walk that, don't force them, walk with them on the journey as well. I will tell you, worship changes can be difficult and painful. If you do this poorly, you might as well have the U-Haul warmed up and gassed up outside the church. I want you to be careful, but they're crucial ultimately to part of what it means to renew your church. Just do them wisely as well.